Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Sounds good.
Okay. Alrighty. 14 August or 14 September. Weekly Marx. We are still looking at chapter 6, Marx's economic manuscript of 1864 to 65, translated by Ben Folks, edited and with an introduction by Fred Mosley. And we're just rolling right along. I think we're up to page 773, I think. With the physiocrats, the difficulty is quite another kind. As the first systematic interpreters of capital, they try to analyze the nature of surplus value in general. For them, this analysis coincides with the analysis of rent, the only form in which surplus value existed for them. Rent-bearing or agricultural capital, therefore, is for them the only capital that produces surplus value, and the agricultural labor that it sets in motion is the only labor giving rise to surplus value, i.e., quite from the capitalist standpoint, the only truly productive labor. They quite rightly regard the production of surplus value as the determining element. Apart from other services, which we shall discuss later on, theirs is the great merit of returning from commercial capital, which operates only in the sphere of circulation, to productive capital, in contrast to the supporters of the mercantile system, which was, in its crude realism, the actual vulgar economics of the day, and which, with its practical interests, entirely swamped the beginnings of scientific analysis conducted by Petty and his successors. In relation to our critique of the mercantile system, it should be borne in mind that we're concerned only with its conception of capital and surplus value. We've already noted that the monetary system correctly proclaims that production for the world market and the transformation of the product into a commodity, hence into money, is the precondition and requirement for capitalist production. In its continuation as the mercantile system, it is no longer the transformation of commodity value into money that is decisive, but instead the production of surplus value, albeit from the irrational standpoint of the circulation sphere, and at the same time in such a way that this surplus value is expressed in surplus money in a favorable balance of trade. But it is also the characteristic feature of the self-interested merchants and manufacturers of that time, and belongs to the period of capitalist development that they represent, that the transformation of feudal agricultural development that they represent, that the transformation of feudal agricultural societies into industrial societies and the resulting industrial struggle of nations on the world market involves an accelerated development of capital which cannot be obtained in the so-called natural way by only compulsory means. It makes an enormous difference whether the national capital is transformed into industrial capital gradually and slowly, or this transformation is accelerated over time by the taxes they impose through protective duties, which rest in fact on the landlords, the yeomanry, and the artisans, by the accelerated expropriation of independent direct producers, and by the forcibly accelerated accumulation and concentration of capital. In short, by the accelerated establishment of the conditions of capitalist production. It also makes an enormous difference in the capitalist and industrial exploitation of the nation's natural productive power. The national character of the mercantile system is therefore not just cant when its spokesmen refer to it on the pretext of being concerned only with the wealth of the nation and the sources of assistance for the state. They declare, in fact, that the interests of the capitalist class and of enrichment in general are the ultimate purpose of the state, and they proclaim their support for bourgeois society against the old supernatural state. At the same time, however, They show their awareness that the development of the interests of capital and the capitalist class of capitalist production has become the basis of the nation's power and predominance in modern society. The physiocrats were also correct to say that, in fact, all production of surplus value, and thus also every development of capital, rested on the productivity of agricultural labor as its natural foundation. If men are not even capable of producing more means of subsistence in a working day, and thus in the narrowest sense more agricultural products, then each worker needs for his own reproduction. If the then each worker needs for his own reproduction, if the daily expenditure of the worker's entire labor power is only sufficient to produce the means of subsistence indispensable for his individual needs, there can be no question of any surplus product or surplus value at all. A level of productivity of agricultural labor which goes beyond the individual needs of the worker is the basis of all society, and in particular the basis of the capitalist mode of production, which releases an ever-growing part of society from the direct production of the means of subsistence, transforming them, as Stewart says, into free hands and making them available for exploitation in other spheres. But what should we say of contemporary economic writers such as Dare, Passy, etc., who, now that classical economics has run its course when it is actually on its deathbed, repeat the most primitive ideas about the natural conditions of surplus labor, and hence surplus value in general, believing themselves to have said something new and striking about ground rent, long after this ground rent has been explained as a particular form and a specific form of surplus value. It is precisely characteristic of vulgar economics that what in a now superseded stage of development was new, original, profound, and justified is repeated at a time when it's flat, incorrect, and stale. It thereby acknowledges that it does not even have an inkling of the problems with which classical economics was concerned. It confuses these with questions that are put forward only at a lower state of development of bourgeois society. It is just the same with its incessant and self-satisfied chewing over of physiocratic notions about free trade. These have long since lost any and every theoretical interest, even if they may be still of some practical interest to some state or other. In a genuine natural economy where no part of the agricultural product or only a very small part enters into the circulation process, and this is itself only a relatively insignificant part of that product of the product that represents the landowner's revenue, as for example, in many Roman latifundia, as also in the manors of Charlemagne's times, and more or less throughout the Middle Ages, see Vinchard. The whole of the product and surplus product of estates by no means consisted simply of the products of agricultural work. It equally included the products of industrial work, the existence of domestic handicrafts and manufacture as an ancillary pursuit of agriculture, which is the basic activity, is the condition for the mode of production on which this natural economy rests, both in European antiquity and medieval times, and still today in the village communities of India, where their traditional form of organization has not yet been destroyed. The capitalist mode of production completely abolishes this connection, a process which can be studied on a large scale, particularly during the last third of the 18th century in England. People who had grown up in more or less semi-feudal societies, such as Herrenschwan, for example, still considered the separation of agriculture and manufacture as a foolhardy social venture, an incomprehensibly risky mode of existence at the end of the 18th century. And even in those agricultural economies of ancient times, which show the greatest similarities with the capitalist rural economy, namely Carthage and Rome, the appropriate analogy is with a plantation economy rather than with the form really corresponding to the capitalist mode of production. There is a formal analogy, although one which also appears to be completely deceptive in all essential points for someone who has understood the capitalist mode of production, unlike Herr Mommsen, who discovers the capitalist mode of production as soon as a monetary economy appears. Even such a formal analogy is to be found nowhere in mainland Italy in ancient times. but only perhaps in Sicily, since this served as an agricultural tributary for Rome, its agriculture being essentially designed for export. Here, one can find farmers in the modern sense. An incorrect conception of the nature of rent has been handed down to modern times, a conception based on the fact that rent in kind still survives from the Middle Ages, in complete contradiction to the conditions of the capitalist mode of production, partly in the tithes paid to the church, and partly as a curiosity in old contracts. The impression is thus given that rent arises not from the price of the agricultural product, but from its quantity, i.e., not from social relations, but from the earth itself. Now, we've already shown how, even though surplus value is expressed in a surplus product, it is not true, conversely, that any surplus product, in the sense of a mere increase in the quantity of the product, represents a surplus value. It can represent a deduction from value. Otherwise, the cotton industry would have had to show an enormous surplus value in 1866 compared with 1846, even though the price of yarn had fallen. Rent may grow enormously as a result of a series of bad harvests, since the price of corn rises, even though this surplus value is expressed in an amount of dearer wheat, which is growing smaller in absolute terms. Conversely, a series of good years may lead to a fall in rent because the price falls, even though the lower rent is expressed in a greater amount of cheaper wheat. The first thing to note about rent in kind, then, is that it's simply a tradition brought over from another mode of production, which survives as a ruin of its former existence, while its contradiction with the capitalist mode of production is shown by the way that it disappeared automatically from private contracts, and where legislation could intervene, as with the tithes, was forcibly abolished as an incongruity, footnote 64. Secondly, however, where it continued to exist on the basis of the capitalist mode of production, it was nothing more, and could be nothing more, than an expression of money rent in medieval guise. Say that a quarter of wheat stands at 40 shillings. Out of this 1 quarter, one part must replace the wages contained in it and be sold as to advance these again. Another part must be sold in order to pay the rent due as taxes. Seed corn and a certain amount of manure are themselves involved in reproduction as commodities wherever the capitalist mode of production and the division of social labor associated with it are developed, and so replacements for these must be bought. A further part of the quarter must be sold to supply money for this. Inasmuch as they do not actually have to be bought, do not really enter into the metamorphosis of commodities, but are taken from the product in kind to go once more, as conditions of production, into its reproduction, which happens not only in agriculture, but in many branches of production that produce constant capital. They are entered into the books in money of account and deducted as constituents of the cost price. The wear and tear of machinery and fixed capital in general must be replaced in money. Finally, there is the profit, which is reckoned on the sum of those expenses that are expressed in real money or in money of account. This profit is represented by a particular part of the gross product determined by its price. The part that then remains forms the rent. If the contractual product rent, product-rent, is greater than this residue as determined by the price, it does not form rent, but is a deduction from profit. Simply by the virtue of this possibility, product-rent, which does not follow the constant price of the commodity and can therefore come to either more or less than the actual rent, and which can form a deduction not just from profit, but from the components required to replace the capital, is antiquated and ripe for removal. This product-rent, in fact, insofar as it is rent not simply in name, but in actual fact, is determined exclusively by the excess of the price of the product over its cost of production. It simply takes this variable magnitude as a constant one. But it is such a homely idea that the product first suffices in kind to feed the workers and then to leave the capitalist farmer more food than he needs, and that the surplus over and over that forms the natural rent. It would be just the same with a calico producer who manufactures 200,000 ells of cloth. This is not only sufficient to clothe his workers and to more than clothe his wife, all his offspring, and himself, it also leaves him calico to sell, and finally to pay a hefty rent in kind. It is such a simple matter. We deduct the production costs of the 200,000 ells, and a surplus of calico must remain over as rent. But what an artificial and naive idea it is to deduct production costs of, say, 15,000 pounds from the 200,000 ells without knowing the sale price of calico, to deduct money from calico and exchange value from a use value, and then to determine the surplus calico in terms of pounds sterling. It is worse than squaring the circle, which is at least based on the concept of limits in which straight lines and curves merge together. But this is Monsieur Posse's recipe. We deduct money from calico before the calico is transformed into money, either in the mind or in actuality. The surplus is the rent, which, however, should be treated naturally. See, for example, Karl Arndt, and not with diabolical sophistries. It is foolishness such as this, the deduction of the production costs, i.e., the production price, from so and so many bushels of wheat, the subtraction of a sum of money from a cubic measure, which is the logical conclusion of this whole natural development of rent. If we consider ground rent in its simplest form, labor rent, where the direct producer devotes one part of the week with tools that belong to him, either legally or in practice, the plow, the draft animals, etc., to land that is in practice his own, and works the other days of the week for the landlord on his estate gratuitously, the situation here is still completely clear. Rent and surplus value are identical. Rent and not profit is the form in which the unpaid surplus labor is expressed. Compare what was said about this form in Book 1, Chapter 2, the extent to which the worker, a self-sustaining serf, can obtain a surplus over his indispensable means of subsistence, hence a surplus over what we in the capitalist mode of production would call the minimum amount of wages, depends, assuming all other circumstances remain the same, on the extent, the length of his statute labor. Statute-labor. This surplus, over and above the necessary means of subsistence, which is the germ of profit in the capitalist mode of production, is thus entirely determined by the level of ground rent, which here is not only is, but appears as unpaid surplus labor, labor for the proprietor of the conditions of production, which here coincide with the land itself, or, inasmuch as they are distinct from it, count merely as an accessory to it. That the serf's product must be sufficient in this case to replace his conditions of labor as well as his subsistence is a situation that remains the same in all modes of production, since it's not a result of this specific form, but rather a natural condition for all continuing and reproductive labor in general, of any continuing production that is always at the same time reproduction, i.e. also reproduction of its own conditions of operation. It is clear, too, that in all forms where the actual worker himself remains the possessor of the means of production and the conditions of labor needed for the production of his own means of subsistence, the property relationship must appear at the same time as a direct relationship of domination and servitude, and the direct producer, therefore, as an unfree person whose unfreedom may, however, undergo a progressive attenuation from serfdom with statute-labor down to a mere tribute obligation. The direct producer in this case is, on our assumption, in possession of his own means of production, the objective conditions of labor needed for the realization of his labor and the production of his means of subsistence. He pursues his agriculture independently, as well as the rural-domestic industry associated with it. This independence is not abolished when, as in India, for example, these self-sustaining peasants form among themselves a more or less natural community of producers. since what is at issue here is independence vis-a-vis the nominal landlord. Under these conditions, the surplus labor for the nominal landowner can only be extorted from them by extra economic compulsion, whatever form this might assume, footnote 68. This differs from the slave or plantation economy in that the slave works with conditions of production that do not belong to him and does not work independently. Relations of personal dependence are therefore necessary. In other words, personal unfreedom in whatever degree and being chained to the land as his accessory bondage in the true sense. If there are no private landowners, but it is the state, as in Asia, which confronts them directly as simultaneously landowner and sovereign, rent and tax coincide, or rather, there does not exist any tax distinct from this form of ground rent. Under these conditions, the relationship of dependence does not need to possess any harsher form, either politically or economically, than that which is common to all subjection to this state. Here, the state is the supreme landlord. Sovereignty here is landed property concentrated at the national level. But for this very reason, there is no private landed property, although there is both private and communal possession and usufruct of the land. The specific economic form in which surplus labor is pumped out of the direct producer determines the relationship of domination and servitude as this grows directly out of production itself and reacts back on it in turn as a determinant. On this is based the entire configuration of the economic community arising from the actual relations of production, and hence also its specific political form. It is, in each case, the direct relationship of the owners of the conditions of production to the immediate producers, a relationship whose particular form naturally corresponds always to a certain level of development of the type and manner of labor, and hence to the development of its social productivity, in which we find the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social edifice, and hence also the political form of the relationship of sovereignty and dependence. In short, the specific form of state in each case. This does not prevent the same economic basis, the same in its major conditions, from displaying endless variations and gradations in its appearance. As a result of innumerable different empirical circumstances, natural conditions, racial relations, historical influences acting from outside, etc., and these can only be understood by analyzing these empirically given. As regards labor rent, the most simple and primitive form of rent, this much is self-evident. Here, rent is the original form of surplus value and coincides with it. On the other hand, it needs no further analysis here that the surplus value coincides with the unpaid labor of others, since this still exists in its visible, palpable form. The labor of the direct producer for himself being still separate, both in time and space, from his work for the landed proprietor, with the latter appearing directly in the brutal form of forced labor for another person. Likewise, the property the land has of yielding a rent is reduced here to a palpably open secret. For the same nature that delivers rent also includes the human labor power that is chained to the land, and the property relationship that forces its owner to exert and activate this labor power beyond the degree that would be required to satisfy his own indispensable needs. The rent consists in the direct appropriation by the landowner of this extra expenditure of labor power. For the direct producer does not pay any further rent on top of this. In this case, where surplus value and rent are not only identical, but the surplus value still palpably takes the form of surplus labor, the natural conditions or limits of rent are immediately evident because they are the limits of surplus labor in general. The direct producer must, number one, have sufficient labor power, while number two, the natural conditions of his labor, in the first instance, the land to be worked, must be fruitful enough, i.e., the natural productivity of his labor must be great enough to allow him the possibility of surplus labor over and above the labor needed to satisfy his own indispensable needs. It is not this possibility that creates rent. Only compulsion makes the possibility a reality. The possibility itself, however, is bound up with subjective and objective natural conditions. Here, too, there's nothing at all mysterious. If labor power is meager and the natural conditions of labor scarce, the amount of surplus labor is also small. But so too, then, are, number one, the needs of the producers, number two, the relative number of landed proprietors to whom this surplus labor accrues, and finally, number three, the surplus product in which this weak quantity of surplus labor is realized with a small number of landed proprietors. Finally, it immediately follows from labor rent that, assuming all other circumstances to be constant, it depends entirely on the scale of the surplus or the forced labor, whether and how far the direct producer is capable of improving his own situation, enriching himself, producing a surplus over and above his indispensable means of subsistence, or to anticipate by introducing a category which does not belong here but applies to a much later mode of production, whether and how far he can produce some kind of profit for himself, i.e., a surplus over and above the minimum of wage he also himself produces, to use a category which was often anticipated here and wrongly so. Rent here is the normal and, so to speak, legitimate form of surplus labor, which absorbs everything. And far from being an excess over and above profit, i.e., in this case, above some other kind of surplus over wages, not only the size of such a profit, but even its very existence, all other circumstances remaining the same, depends on the size of the rent, i.e., of the surplus labor that is compulsorily to be performed for the proprietor. Some historians have expressed their amazement that when the direct producer is not a proprietor but only a possessor, all his surplus labor in fact belonged de jure to the landowner. Now, it's still possible for this villein or serf to develop independent means of his own, or relatively speaking, to become wealthy. It is evident, however, that in the aboriginal and undeveloped conditions on which the social relation of production and the mode of production corresponding to it are based, tradition must play a predominant role. It's also evident here that, as always, it is in the interest of the dominant section of the society to sanctify the existing situation as a law and to fix the limits consecrated by custom, usage, and tradition as legal limits, even ignoring any other factors. This happens automatically as soon as the constant reproduction of the basis of the existing situation, the relationship underlying it, assumes in the course of time a regular and ordered form. And this regulation and order is itself an indispensable aspect of any mode of production that is to become solidly established and free from mere accident or caprice. It is precisely the form in which it is socially established, and hence the form of its relative emancipation from mere caprice and accident. It can attain this form in stagnant and stationary conditions, both of the production process and of the relations that correspond to it, simply by reproducing itself, which will happen automatically. Once the reproduction of these relations of production is continued for a certain length of time, it is reinforced as a tradition and sanctified as a social rule, order, and law. If we assume, for example, that the amount of statute labor on the proprietor's estate is originally 2 or 3 days a week, we must assume that this surplus labor, since its form depends on the undeveloped conditions of all labor's social productive powers, since it depends on the crudeness of the mode of labor itself, by its nature, takes up a relatively far smaller part of the total labor of the direct producers than in more developed modes of production, and in the capitalist mode of production in particular. 2 days of statute labor a week, for example, persist as a constant quantity, regulated by customary or written law. But the productivity of the remaining days of the week that the direct producer has at his disposal is a variable quantity which must develop as he progresses in experience, just as the new needs with which he becomes familiar, the expansion of the market for his products, and the growing security he has that this portion of his labor power is at his disposal will spur him to increased exertions. It should not be forgotten in this connection that the use of this labor power is by no means confined to agriculture, but also includes rural domestic industry. This provides the possibility of a certain degree of economic development, dependent, of course, on favorable circumstances, innate racial characteristics, and the capacity of the latter to develop and change. Produce rent. Economically speaking, the transformation of labor rent into produce rent does not change the nature of ground rent at all. This consists, in the forms we're dealing with here, in the fact that ground rent is the only dominant and normal form of surplus value or surplus labor, which is expressed in turn in its being the only surplus labor or surplus product which the direct producer who finds himself in possession of the conditions of labor needed for his own reproduction has to provide for the owner of the one condition of labor that includes everything else at this stage, the land. While on the other hand, it is only the land that confronts him as the property of another person, a condition of labor that has become independent of him and is personified in the landowner. But while produce rent is the dominant and furthest developed form of ground rent, it always remains more or less accompanied by survivals of the earlier form, i.e., rent to be paid directly in labor, statute labor, whether the proprietor be a private person or the state. This form of rent presupposes a higher cultural level on the part of the immediate producer, i.e., a higher stage of development of his labor and of society in general. And it distinguishes itself from the preceding form by the fact that surplus labor is no longer performed in its natural form, i.e., no longer under the direct supervision and compulsion of the landlord or his understrappers. Rather, the immediate producer, driven on by the force of circumstances instead of direct compulsion and by legal requirements instead of by the whip, is himself responsible for performing this surplus labor. Surplus production, in the sense of production over and above the indispensable needs of the immediate producer and within a field of production that actually belongs to him on the land that he himself exploits, instead of, as in the previous situation, on the landlord's estate alongside and outside his own, has here already become the self-evident rule. In this relationship, the immediate producer has the use of more or less his entire labor time, even if one part of his labor time, originally more or less the whole surplus part of his labor time, continues to belong for free to the landowner, although the latter no longer receives this directly in its own natural form, but rather in the natural form of the product in which it is realized. The burdensome interruption of labor for the landowner, which was a more or less constant feature of statute labor, depending on the way this was regulated. Compare, for example, what was said earlier about the corvée in the Danubian principalities, now disappears in the case of pure produce rent, or is at least reduced to a few brief intervals in the year where certain statutory obligations persist along produce rent. The work of the producer for himself and his work for the landowner are no longer palpably separate in time and space. This produce rent, in its pure form, even though relics of it may be handed down to more developed modes and relations of production, still presupposes a natural economy, i.e., it presupposes that the economic conditions are produced entirely, or at least in the main, by the economic unit itself being directly replaced and reproduced out of its gross product. It also presupposes the union of rural domestic industry and agriculture. The surplus product which forms rent is the product of this combined agricultural-industrial family labor. Whether the produce rent includes a greater or smaller amount of industrial products, as was frequently the case in the Middle Ages, or whether it is paid simply in the form of agricultural products proper. In this form of rent, the produce rent in which surplus labor is expressed need by no means take up the entire excess labor of the rural family. On the contrary, the producer has a greater room to maneuver compared with labor rent to gain time for excess labor on products that belong to him, just like the product of that labor which satisfies his indispensable needs. In this form, too, greater differences arise in the economic situation of the individual direct producers. There is at least the possibility available for this and the possibility for the direct producer of obtaining the means whereby he may, in turn, exploit the labor of others. Yet this does not affect our discussion of the pure form of rent, as we cannot embark hereon the endlessly varied combinations in which the specific forms of rent may be combined, adulterated, and amalgamated. The form of produce rent, bound up with a particular type of product and of production itself, the connection indispensable to it between agriculture and domestic industry, and the almost total self-sufficiency that the peasant family thereby obtains, its almost complete independence from the market and from the movement of production and the history of that part of society outside itself. In brief, the character of natural economy as such all make this form eminently suitable as a basis for those static conditions of society we can see in Asia, for example. Here, as in the earlier form of labor rent, ground rent is the normal form of surplus value, and therefore of surplus labor, i.e., of the entire excess labor that the direct producer must perform for nothing. In actual fact, therefore, compulsorily for the owner of his most essential condition of labor, the land, even if this compulsion no longer confronts him in its previous brutal form. Profit, if we may incorrectly give this name in anticipation to that fraction of the excess of his labor over and above the necessary labor which he appropriates for himself, so little determines produce rent that it rather grows up behind its back, meeting a natural limit in the level of the produce rent. The latter may be so high as seriously to endanger the reproduction of the conditions of labor, the means of production themselves, making the expansion of production more or less impossible and reducing the direct producers to the physical minimum of the means of subsistence. Now, this is particularly the case when this form is found in existence and exploited by a conquering trading nation, as by the English in India, for example. Money rent. What we mean by money rent is not the industrial or commercial ground rent based on the capitalist mode of production, which is merely an excess over the average profit, but the ground rent that arises simply from a formal transformation of produce rent, hence proceeds from the basis of the latter, just as that was simply transformed labor rent. Instead of the product itself, the direct producer now has to pay his landowner, whether the state or a private person, the price of this. An excess product in its natural form is no longer sufficient. It has to be transformed from this natural form into the money form. Although the direct producer still continues to produce at least the greatest part of his needs, his means of subsistence himself, a portion of his product must now be transformed into a commodity and be produced as a commodity. The character of the entire mode of production is thus more or less changed. It loses its independence, its separation from any social context. It becomes dependent on market conditions. What now becomes decisive is the proportion of production costs, which now include greater or smaller monetary expenditures, or at least the excess of the part of the gross product to be transformed into money over and above the part that must serve, on the one hand, again, as the means of production, on the other hand, as direct means of subsistence. The basis of this type of rent, however, though it is now approaching its dissolution, remains the same as for the produce rent that formed its starting point. The direct producer is still the hereditary or otherwise traditional possessor of the land who has to provide for the landowner as the proprietor of this most essential condition of production an excess of compulsory labor, i.e., unpaid labor provided without an equivalent in the form of the surplus product transformed into money. Property in agricultural equipment and other movable items which are distinct from the land itself is already transformed in the earlier forms into the property of the direct producers, first of all, simply in practice, but also later in law. And this is still more of a premise for the form of money rent. The transformations of produce rent into money rent that takes place at first sporadically and then on a more or less national scale presupposes an already more significant development of trade, urban industry, commodity production in general, and therefore monetary circulation. It also presupposes that products have a market price and are sold more or less approximately at their values, which in the earlier forms by no means needs to be the case. In the eastern part of Europe, we can still see something of this transformation going on today. How little it can be accomplished without a certain development of labor's social productive power is attested to by various failed attempts under the Roman Empire to make this transformation, followed by a regression to rent in kind, after which the attempt was made to transform into money rent, at least part of this rent existing as a state tax. The same difficulty of transition was shown, for example, under the Ancien Regime in France by the amalgamation and adulteration of money rent through the addition of residues of its earlier forms. But money rent, as a transformed and contrasting form of produce rent, is the final form of the type of ground rent we have been considering here, while being at the same time the form of its dissolution, namely ground rent as the normal form of surplus value and the unpaid surplus labor which has to be performed for the owner of the conditions of production. In its pure form, this rent, just like labor rent and produce rent, does not represent any excess over and above profit. In its concept, it includes profit, insofar as profit arises alongside it in practice as a particular part of surplus labor. The money rent, like rent in its earlier forms, is still the normal limit to this profit, which can develop only in proportion to the possibility of exploiting that labor, whether a person's own excess labor or that of others, which remains after the surplus labor expressed in money rent has been paid. If a profit really does arise alongside the rent, it is not the profit that sets a limit to rent, but inversely rent which sets a limit to profit. As we've already said, however, money rent is at the same time the form of dissolution of the ground rent we have thus so far been dealing with here, which coincides with surplus labor and surplus value. Ground rent as the normal and dominant form of surplus value. Now, if we leave aside all intermediate forms, such as that of the small peasant farmer, money rent must lead either to the transformation of the land into free peasant property or to the form characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, rent paid by the farmer capitalist. With money rent, the traditional relationship fixed by customary law between the landowner, whether this is the state or a private proprietor, and his vassal, who possesses and exploits one part of the land, is necessarily transformed into a contractual relationship, a purely monetary relationship determined by fixed rule of positive law. The possessor of the land virtually becomes a mere tenant. On the one hand, the transformation is utilized where general conditions for production are suitable for the expropriation by stages of the old peasant possessor and installation in his place of the capitalist farmer. On the other hand, it allows the former possessor to buy himself out of his obligation to pay rent and leads to his transformation into an independent peasant farmer with full ownership in the land he cultivates. The transformation of rent in kind into money rent, moreover, is not only necessarily accompanied, but even anticipated by the formation of a class of non-possessing day laborers who hire themselves out for money. During the period of its development, the new class still appears only sporadically, and before its maturity, when it enters the picture on a national scale, the custom necessarily takes shape among the better off rent-paying peasants of exploiting agricultural labors on their own account, just as in the feudal period, the wealthier peasant serfs already kept serfs of their own. In this way, it gradually becomes possible for them to build up a certain amount of capital and to transform themselves into future capitalists. Among the old possessors of the land, producing for themselves, this provides a seedbed for the nurturing of capitalist farmers whose development is conditioned by the development of capitalist production, not just in the countryside, but in general, and who advance particularly rapidly when, as in England in the 16th century, they are aided by such particularly favorable conditions as the progressive depreciation of money at that time, which, given the traditionally long terms of tenancy contracts, invariably enriched them at the landowner's expense. I'm going to stop now because we have another thing coming up, and we will continue on around page 785, and I will, as they say, stop the live stream. And then stop the share.